Breakfast in the Desert on Desert Radio.
That's right. You are tuned into Breakfast in the Desert here on Desert Radio 95.3 FM. Time on the clock is 7:31 and we will continue on with the show. But just before we get into our next conversation for the morning, we do have a question of the day running for you. And that question is, how best can society deal with stigma around mental health? How best can society deal with stigma around mental health? You can head over to our Facebook platform, that is at the Namibian, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what your thoughts are around this subject. And you can also send me a message on our WhatsApp line, and the number for that is 0811446083. 0811446083. So definitely come through on WhatsApp. You can drop a message or you can leave me a voice note, and we'll get into those just a little bit later. Now, on the same subject, as Namibia joins the rest of the world today in commemorating World Mental Health Day, the overall objective of World Mental Health Day is to raise awareness of mental health issues around the world and to mobilize efforts in support of mental health. Now, the day provides an opportunity for all stakeholders working on mental health issues to talk about their work and what more needs to be done to make mental health care a reality for people worldwide. And to discuss and unpack this a little further, we are now joined on the line by clinical psychologist that is Dr. Shaun Whittaker to talk about this. Dr. Whittaker, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Desert Radio. How are you?
We are well, thank you. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to join us, Dr. Whittaker. And just to get right into our conversation, talk to us about, the importance of World Mental Health Day for those that are living with mental health challenges.
It's certainly a very important day. We need to, like you said, that we need to raise awareness around mental health because there are so many misconceptions, and I think that's a big part of what the stigma is all about, the lack of knowledge about what mental health is all about. If people don't understand something, they obviously will have all kinds of false beliefs around it. Mm-hmm. For example, I think there's a huge misconception that mental health is genetic in origin. It is something to be ashamed of. It is something that you cannot change. And that is, that contributes to some of the misunderstandings around mental health. So a day like this, World Mental Health Day, is extremely important to us as healthcare providers as well, mm-hmm. so that we continue to educate the public as much as possible. I must say, the stigma around mental health in Namibia has certainly improved over the years. But of course, it's an ongoing conversation, and we need to continue to do this kind of public education, consciousness raising, awareness raising. So, it's a crucial conversation. Mm-hmm. It's a reality for all of us in terms of, everyday life, our relationships, our emotions, how we experience our existence. I think people tend to think about mental health in a very narrow way, but I would like to think about it as a broader topic, or the broader definition of mental health, that it's about how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to other people, and of course, the kind of meaning we find in life, the kind of food we eat, the kind of daily activities we engage in. So it's in many ways, I like to think about the broader definition of mental health in terms of our psychological and emotional well-being. Mm. Sometimes it sounds very superficial if we say that it's about happiness. Mm. Whereas I think it's, there should be a deeper conversation around mental health.
And Dr. Whittaker, as you rightfully pointed out, stigma around the issues of mental health in the country has reduced quite a bit over the years in Namibia. However, that stigma still exists, right? And there's a lot of lack of understanding of the issue, as well as a lot of misconception around the issue. So, with that in context, how do you think Namibia is doing as a country in trying to break down and deconstruct some of these misconceptions? And are we driving enough awareness campaigns around mental health in the country?
Well, I think we are doing a program like this, for example. I think Namibia is really trying to do something, and I think we should compliment the country for that. Radio programs like this have become so common. And so, yes, so at least we have these conversations now. When I started out in Namibia about 25 years ago, people referred to the mental health unit as, the mad camp, where mad people go, where crazy people go. And that was the level of discourse at the time, and it was clearly a very disturbing narrative to me because it blames the victims, it negates their reality, it frames the conversation, in such a very negative paradigm. Fortunately, I think as a country we have moved away from that. There's certainly more respect, for not only the issue of mental health, but of course for the people themselves. The reality is that all of us have mental health challenges. At some point we all become depressed. A relationship breaks up, we lose a loved one, whatever the case might be. The reality is there for all of us. And the sooner we admit to that, the better, so that we can, move beyond stigma, move beyond all these stereotypes and all these labels that effectively, shut down the conversation before we even have it. So I think we're doing well as a country. Obviously, like everywhere else, we need to continue to have that. There's always room for improvement, but at least I think we are having the conversation, and it's so welcome, it's so refreshing, certainly for me as a clinical psychologist, that we continue to have these conversations. And I've definitely seen the progress over the last 25 years.
And then with that in mind, the years that you've been working in mental health as a clinical psychologist, if you have this information on hand, could you please share with us how widespread the issue of mental health is in Namibia? Do we have data that indicates how many people are affected with a mental health condition, how many people seek assistance through a therapist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist in the country?
I would really like someone to do that research for us. Generally speaking, what we know is that at least 1 in every third person, 1 in 3 is experiencing some active mental health condition. And of course, in Namibia, if you look at the suicide statistics, I think that is usually what we focus on when we have this conversation, and of course it's a very important issue. But certainly if you look at our suicide statistics, then we know that Namibia has very real mental health challenges. We have consistently, over the last decade at least, we've had an above average suicide rate. And that should give you an indication of what is happening in terms of, depression levels, anxiety levels, addiction levels, trauma, of course. You can be sure that all these areas are, at an above average level in Namibia. Namibia is an extremely traumatized society. We have to accept that. We definitely need to have, more conversations around trauma, the way in which Namibians, continue, I think, to grapple with trauma, the way in which trauma is manifested, and of course what we can do, not only as individuals, but as a society about trauma, because trauma is not only an individual issue. So there's no doubt about the fact that we are dealing with really high levels of mental health issues in this country.
And you mentioned trauma as one of the main causes of mental health challenges in the country. But what other causes are we seeing as playing a role in mental health in our country?
Well, there's this best-selling book called Lost Connections, and it's about the real causes of depression and anxiety. It was written by a British journalist by the name of Johan Hari. And like I said, it was a best-selling book because it focuses on the issue of job dissatisfaction. The essence of the argument is that people have become disconnected from meaningful work. And in fact, he goes so far to say that job dissatisfaction is the main cause of depression. I think it's an important issue because it's on target that most people find themselves in unfulfilling jobs. Very often there's a monotony and a routineness to a job. There's no real challenges for people. At the same time, there's not enough social connection with colleagues, with people around us. So for me, this is an important issue, firstly for people to realize that depression is certainly, caused by genetic makeup, that depression, and of course there's a big conversation at the moment, especially in Britain, around the fact that depression is definitely also not about chemical imbalances. I'm not sure how many Namibians have been following that debate. Some professor of psychiatry, Johanna Moncrief, published not so long ago a study that looked at this very carefully and concluded that depression is not caused by chemical imbalances. Now, if you take into consideration the book Lost Connections, then of course you get some of the answers about what depression is all about. The sense of alienation, the sense of unfulfillment that people experience. And of course the question then becomes, what can people do about it? Certainly, we have to work, we have to keep society going, but for me, one of the solutions is for people to make a deliberate effort to have those social connections, as with colleagues or of course friends, definitely with loved ones. And of course the question of leisure time and extramural activities, I think an important part of that as well. People should be able to engage in more self-care and so on. So, I think once you get beyond the stigma and the stereotypes, I think we can have some very real conversations about depression, for example. Quickly, another angle is, of course, nutrition. I have been interested in the role of nutrition in mental health for a very long time. And there's no doubt about the fact that nutrition plays a crucial role. If you consider vitamin B and the impact on vitamin B of vitamin B on the brain, for example, there's an interesting study that came out of Australia, for example, where they fortified their bread flour with vitamin B. And found that this fortified bread brought down the levels of Korsakoff syndrome by 40%. Now, Korsakoff syndrome is usually something that happens to alcoholics. The alcohol destroys, the back part of the brain. And people then, the occipital lobe of the brain, and people then develop what we call Korsakoff syndrome. They have visual hallucinations and so on. The point is that, if you have proper nutrition, you could actually deal with some of these mental health conditions like Korsakoff syndrome, or there was a Canadian psychiatrist called Abraham Hoffer who believed that we could wipe out schizophrenia if we fortified bread flour with vitamin B3, for example. So for me, certainly one of the ideas I have is that if we in Namibia, if we could fortify a bread with vitamin B, a bread that should be subsidized by the government so that it is, inexpensive and accessible to everyone in Namibia. I think that alone will make a huge difference to mental health in the countries. If we could fortify just one bread loaf, make it, inexpensive, make it accessible to all Namibians. But it speaks to the importance of nutrition in mental health. I think that is something that we sometimes, forget about. I am teaching a module on neuropsychology at the University of Namibia at the moment, and I'm having a wonderful debate with my students about the impact of cesarean sections on special children. And from the research, it's very clear from what we've been reading and discussing that if a baby is born through a cesarean section, there's a 30% chance that the baby could develop autism spectrum disorder. So, so it's these are ongoing conversations. They're important conversations that we should also have. I think it's good that we discuss depression and trauma, but we should also have these other conversations about mental health. Or if you think about Namibia with our very high motor vehicle accident rate, I think we have a significant level of traumatic brain injuries, which is a crucial issue, in the mental health field as well. Especially if the damage is to the front of the brain. So we need to have these broader mental health conversations as well.
And from the sound of it, as we generally pick up when we have these conversations, is that it's very overarching how these challenges present, and it's also very intersectional. As you talked about, trauma, talked about the workplace, talked about how a child might be born and how that could affect mental health, and then talked about nutrition as well. But just to go back to thinking about job satisfaction, workplace, work-life balance. In that regard, how best do you think companies and institutions should deal with the challenges of mental health within their employee complement? And are local companies doing enough in that regard currently?
I think companies are trying. One would hope that all the companies would have regular programs around mental health, workshops, awareness raising, be aware that, depression, trauma, anxiety, that these are very real issues for all of us, and it is not something that people should be ashamed of, that there should be open conversations at workplaces as well, that there should be, support systems, that people should feel free, to talk to the human resource personnel when they are going through a tough time. I'm sorry to say it, when I started off 25 years ago, there was a real problem at so many places in the country when people wanted to take, sick leave because they were depressed. And simply because many workplaces didn't take it seriously. People would say, but you're fine, you can come to work, there's nothing wrong with you don't have the flu, so that was the mentality, long ago. That has fortunately changed, and I think workplaces do take this more seriously now. One would obviously hope that there's, at least at the workplace, that people make special efforts to have these social connections, to make sure you have tea time together as colleagues, that you have conversations with each other, that at least you hang out together now and then, you have a social gathering on Fridays. One would hope that, that you have this kind of social interaction at the workplace, because I think that has to be structured, that has to be encouraged. Otherwise, colleagues won't really have that social connection with one another. And I think it makes a big difference in terms of how satisfied people are at the workplaces. So it's about enabling that kind of social connection in that context. I think you would have a more productive workforce if you allow that kind of social cohesion at the workplace.
And then just to look at another demographic, I want us to discuss a little bit mental health in children, right? Now, there are, of course, many challenges in life that can influence and affect the mental well-being of a child. But I want us to talk about the challenge of mental health and its prevalence in children who are born into, broken marriages or unstable homes, events and situations, environments that can also be quite traumatic. So on that level, how is Namibia dealing with mental health in children, and how best do we go about helping children that are affected by trauma in their living environment?
It's a very important question, partly because we tend to underestimate the emotional sensitivity of children. I think we often forget that children can also become depressed. Children can also be very anxious. Children can struggle, to focus in school. There's this merciless culture of teasing in Namibian primary schools that undoubtedly, impacts tremendously on the self-esteem of our children. As like you say, at home as well. If there's violence at home, if there's bickering at home, of course, it will impact the child. They might have nightmares, they might have bedwetting, they might struggle to focus in school. Unfortunately, very often it is only, once the child struggles in the school setting that this is picked up. Otherwise, it's them on their own, struggling with their anxiety, struggling with their nightmares. If mom and dad are going through conflict, of course, the children do suffer. What I see very often in primary school, especially with those students, grandparents pass away. And they, of course, go through a process of mourning, through bereavement. And once again, we tend to underestimate what that is doing to children as well. So the point is that we need to realize that mental health is a very real issue for children as well. At the very least, we should speak to our children, ask them how they feel about school, how they feel about their friends, how they feel about grandfather passing away, how do they sleep at night, do they have bad dreams. If there's bedwetting, surely it's a sign of high anxiety. If they don't want to go to school in the morning because they have stomach ache, then perhaps there is something happening at school. The stomach ache is simply a sign of nervousness. So I think we need to be more conscious of the emotional state of our children. Something that I feel extremely strongly about is this culture of spanking in Namibia that is unfortunately still very strong. It still happens in homes. Fortunately, it is no longer allowed in our schools, but we definitely need to have more awareness about people, parents, families also stopping it in the home setting. There's not a single advantage to spanking a child, not a single advantage. And ultimately, the emotional consequences are quite severe. I see it all the time in my daily work. People who struggle with very high anxiety levels, inevitably, they were raised with spanking. They were raised in a very strict family, and so they pay the price with very high anxiety levels when they are grown-ups. So if we are going to make a huge difference to the mental health of Namibian children, we really should, ban spanking in the country, stop spanking in the home setting, and teach our parents non-violent ways of dealing with children. It would make a tremendous difference in terms of the mental health situation in the country.
And then lastly, Dr. Whittaker, just before I let you go, I just want us to talk a little bit about resources and services available in the country. Do we have enough facilities to help people affected with any mental health challenges? And just talk us through a little bit of what is available to the public in that regard.
Well, we obviously have the mental health unit in Windhoek. And then we have a smaller unit, I think it's in Oshakati. But generally speaking, outside those two facilities in southern Namibia, in Gobabas, in the rest of the country, I think it's if you don't have medical aid, if you're not in the private system, it is quite a challenge to access mental health services. My impression is that people ultimately go to the government clinics and hospitals, and it is mainly handled at that level by the medical doctor or the nurse who is in charge. But we obviously need to have we need a psychiatric facility, for example, in southern Namibia. There's no doubt about the fact that Kitmanshoop, for example, needs a psychiatric unit, a mental health unit. And I mean, I'm sure we could pinpoint other areas in the country as well. So no, I mean, I think we need to put more resources into the mental health infrastructure. Look, for me, we don't necessarily need to set up buildings everywhere. I mean, with social media, with the wonderful technology that we have, we could Skype with patients. I sometimes Skype with patients from other parts of the country. So we could simply set up such an infrastructure, and it could be done in that way. We could have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, sit in Windhoek. But of course, patients in the rest of the country would need to have access, to a laptop, to these kinds of facilities, so it can be done that we could make this widely available in the country. But we unfortunately not yet there where I said would like to see us as a country in terms of making mental health services available to each and every Namibian everywhere in the country. Including, of course, the issue, of language, that ultimately we need to have psychiatrists and psychologists who can speak all the different Namibian languages as well. So that's sort of a vision, I think, that we could work towards.
Well, Dr. Whittaker, thank you so much for making time this morning just to talk to us a little bit about the state of mental health in Namibia as we commemorate World Mental Health Day.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep up the good work there.
Thank you so much. Have a good day further.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.